Welcome to session 7 of our study on the book of Joshua and Judges. In this session, we begin the book of Judges. Joshua is dead, and we are surprised, or not surprised, to find that all the land of Canaan has not yet been conquered. We're going to read chapter 1 and the first 10 verses of chapter 2. There's going to be more fighting and conquering and some failure to conquer, and we'll read some passages that sound very much like passages we've read in the book of Joshua. But first, we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills so we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The book of Judges is certainly connected to Joshua. It's a continuation of the conquest of the land of Canaan, the promised land. But if we are to consider Joshua as the conclusion to the Israelites' journey in the wilderness, the Exodus, or a conclusion to the Torah, then Judges may be considered a prelude to the period of monarchy. At least in the beginning, Joshua and Judges seem almost to be two versions of the same story. In Judges 1, verse 1 through 2, verse 10 comprises the introduction to the book of Judges. It follows by a paradigmatic account which recounts the pattern that each major judge, to a greater or lesser extent, follows. Joyce Wellhausen notes that Judges is parallel to Joshua. Unlike the book of Joshua, however, Joshua does not lead all Israel in Judges. The incompleteness of the conquest is acknowledged unreservedly. It was once thought that Judges 1 was an older, more accurate version of the same events. More recently, it has been acknowledged that the chapter we are about to read also presents many problems. It is a collection of miscellaneous fragments of varying dates and varying reliability. To represent it, or even some part of it, as the earliest and most reliable account of the conquest of Canaan is to oversimplify the whole problem. So we're going to begin reading chapter 1 of Judges, the first 7 verses. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites, to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand." Judah said to his brother Simeon, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. And they came upon Adonai-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adonai-Bezek fled, but they pursued him, and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has paid me back. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. Clearly, the beginning of the first verse after the death of Joshua is a pointed repetition of the formula that begins the book of Joshua, where it is Moses who has died. In verse 2, the Lord said, "Judah shall go up." The prominence of Judah in the vanguard of the conquest patently reflects the later period when Judah was the seat of a Davidic monarchy and the chief remaining tribe. The report here moves from Judah's military success in the south to the failures of the other tribes in the north. Then we have the strange story of Adonai-Bezek, whose fingers and toes are chopped off, both a humiliation and a means of preventing him from becoming a combatant again. This grisly detail is an apt thematic and imagistic introduction to Judges, the most violent of all the books of the Bible. We will see much worse before we leave here. We read verses 8 through 10. Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the people of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb, and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Araba, and they defeated Shazar, and Ammon and Talmai. Verse 7 tells us that they brought Adoniah Bezek to Jerusalem where he died. Then in verse 8 we hear that Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it and set it on fire. This is somewhat puzzling because a few verses down in verse 21 we hear that the Benjamites were unable to drive out the Jebusites from Jerusalem, but continued to coexist with them. 2 Samuel 5 says that it was David who conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites, probably 2 centuries after the events described in Judges. Let's go on with verses 11 through 15. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debar. The name of Debar was formerly Kiriath Shepher. And then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Shepher and takes it, I will give him my daughter Ashish as wife. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him his daughter Ashish as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. As she dismounted from her donkey, Caleb said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have sent me in the land of Negeb, give me also Gol of Maam. So Caleb gave her Upper Golath and Lower Golath. The story here repeats in virtually identical language the story told in Joshua chapter 15, verses 13 through 19. The territory in the southern part of the land of Israel is called Negeb, which means terrain that supports little or no vegetation. We go on to verse 16. The descendants of Hobab the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near the Arad. And then they went and settled with the Amalekites. Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction. So the city was called Hormah. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjamites to this day. Verses 16 through 19 disrupt the connection between 15 and 20 and were likely added to this introduction at a later date. In these verses, we hear that Judah conquered the Philistine cities. In verse 18, for example, we're told that Judah took Gaza and its territory. It's not certain at what point the Philistines arrived in Canaan, but well before the time of David. Gaza was under the control of the Philistines, and they were still a potent military threat at the time of Saul and David. Verse 19 summarizes Judah's accomplishments. The Lord was with Judah. Following the book of Joshua, this sounds very similar to Joshua 6:27, which says, the Lord was with Joshua. We'll go on to verse 22 through 28. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with him. The house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. When the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you. So he showed them the way into the city, and they put the city to the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. So the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz. That is its name to this day. It's difficult to know how to read verses 22 through 26, which seem to narrate the success of the house of Joseph. It is significant that these successes are immediately tempered by the failures of both Manasseh and Ephraim in verses 27 through 29. In addition, it is noteworthy that in contrast to Judah, which practiced a complete ban on the native Canaanites in verse 17, the house of Joseph lets someone escape. This may reflect a negative value judgment. Go on to verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh, and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor, or its villages, or the inhabitants of Eblim, its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo, or its villages. But the Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not, in fact, drive them out. We have now moved to the north. Bethel was to become a central cultic location in the northern kingdom of Israel after the split in the monarchy. The chapter from verse 28 on spells out a theme of incompletion that had fluctuated throughout the book of Joshua. If you recall, in the first half of Joshua, the conquest of the land appeared to be comprehensive. In the second half, there were indications that much remains to be conquered. Let's go on to verse 29 through 33. Start with Ephraim. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Naphol, but the Canaanites lived among them and became subjects to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon, of Malab, or Ashib, or Helbah, or of Apik, or of Rehob. But the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. Akko and Sidon are far to the north near the present-day border with Lebanon. We notice that Israel is increasingly unable to drive out the inhabitants. Let's go on with verses 34 through 36, the end of the chapter. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites continued to live in Har-Hers, in Aljon, and in Sebulun, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akabrim, from Selah and upward. That the Lord is present is mentioned 12 times in this introduction. Brettler suggests that this fact does not make this unit necessarily into a predominantly theological rather than a political book. Politics and theology cannot be totally separated in the ancient world. The first thing that strikes one in reading chapter 1 through verses 1 through 36 is that it paints the same kind of picture of Israel's partial military victories after Joshua's death as Joshua 13 through 21 described before his death. There are military successes primarily by Judah and Simeon, but even these are partial, and it appears to be the failures of Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan that are really emphasized. Another thing about the chapter is that it repeats with only a few slight changes information that is already given in the book of Joshua. If the entire book of Joshua presented us with a balanced description of the partial occupation of the land as the fulfillment of God's promises, this first chapter of Judges repeats this complex picture for the period immediately following Joshua's death. Looked at in this way, we see that Judges 1 takes a central position described in the preceding book and applies it to the period following the death of that book's main hero, Joshua, with the help of an almost word-for-word repetition of many utterances from the previous book. But this was very much the case, as we have seen with Joshua 1 vis-a-vis Deuteronomy, largely by means of a number of literal or paraphrasing repetitions of utterances from Deuteronomy. Joshua 1 recapitulated the central position of the book of Deuteronomy and applied it to the period following the death of that book's main hero, Moses. The effect is the same in both instances. The book begins by encapsulating a central position of the preceding book before or as it proceeds with its own narrative. The past is reviewed as the narrated present interprets and implies it. The big difference between the opening chapters of these two books is that one does it with words alone, Joshua 1, and the other with the narrated actions, Judges 1. And as to the books themselves, the question in Joshua is not whether Israel under Joshua would occupy the land, but how much or how little they would occupy. That they would occupy the land had already been decided during Moses' lifetime, as narrated in Deuteronomy 9 and 10. The book of Judges goes a step further. Now the question is not how much or how little land Israel would occupy during the period of the Judges, but why they had not been able to completely drive out the inhabitants of the land. The book of Judges, like Joshua, briefly recapitulates the previous book before interpreting it further. We're going to go now to chapter 2, some of which may seem very familiar. When we finish the first 10 verses, we're going to go back and talk once again about the relationship of this introduction to Judges with the book of Joshua, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their God shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named the place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. The angel or messenger here is not speaking in his own person, we understand, but is serving as God's mouthpiece, quoting his words. In verse 2, we hear of smashing the enemy's altars, but the angel goes on to condemn Israel. Let's go on to verse 6 through 10. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites all went to their own inheritances to take possession of the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. So they buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Moreover, the whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. In verse 6, Joshua dismisses the people, making clear that somehow this entire passage loops back to the end of the book of Joshua somehow. Judges 1 through 2:10 appears to be a conglomeration of material, miscellany, and repository of diverse material, a structure not typical of the beginning of biblical books. The very close correspondence between the original end of Joshua and the end of this introduction to the Judges is striking. Let's read again Joshua 24, 28 through 31. So Joshua sent the people away to their inheritance. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. They buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. Now again, Judges 2, 6 through 9. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites all went to their own inheritance to take possession of the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. They buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. These correspondences present yet another problem and a clue. It is extremely unlikely that in the two succeeding books the conclusion of one would be identical to the introduction to the next. The beginning of the answer lies in the observation that Judges 2, 6 through 9 should be considered a resumptive repetition of Joshua 24, 28 through 31. While the resumptive repetition has various purposes, its more typical use is by an editor who through this device marks the return to the original text which he has supplemented. Brettler has suggested that Judges 1, 2 through 10 may also be an appendix to Joshua. He also suggests that at some point these passages belong to more what preceded than to what followed. That is, it may have been part of the ending of the book of Joshua. It is not clear when these verses broke away and became associated with Judges. Perhaps some general desire for symmetry prevailed. The movement of this material flanks the stories about Judges with an introduction and a conclusion, in which the actual Judges are absent. Once this material was shifted from an appendix to an introduction, several changes were made. The most obvious was that the proper opening for Judges needed to be created. This was done through the addition of the words "after the death of Joshua," which was most likely to be modeled on the introduction of Joshua 1 after the death of Moses. The person responsible for this change must not have realized that this addition contradicted the end of the appendix, specifically 2:8, which again narrates Joshua's death. Judges 2:10 was also created after this section was moved to its current place, introducing Judges. This was used to modify 2:7. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And we have 2:10. Moreover, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Obviously implying that the people served the Lord only during the time of Joshua. In this way, it serves as a brilliant segue into verse 11, which we'll cover next week. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. This model for the change in status of some form of Judges 1 through 2:10 from an appendix that was tied to what preceded to an introduction that is connected to what follows cannot be proven. It is doubtful that some manuscript will be found in which Joshua ends with these verses and the Judges begins with 2:11. Yet the proposal suggested cannot be dismissed as pure conjecture because it also helps to explain many of the very strange features of Judges 1 through 2:10. The beginning of this chapter also looks curiously similar to the end of Judges in chapter 20, verse 18, which reads, "The Israelites proceeded to go up to Bethel, where they inquired of God, 'Which of us shall go up first to fight against the Benjamites?' And the Lord answered, 'Judah shall go up first.'" It appears likely that at some point, 1 and 2, and 20:18 were formed to parallel each other. Don't know that, but seems likely. Moshe Weinfeld suggested that there is no doubt that the document of Judges 1 tendaciously serves to glorify the tribe of Judah and to lessen the stature of Israel in the north. This tendency, which is interlocked with the criticism of Benjamin, derives, it seems, from circles from the house of David, who sought to show that Judah, David's tribe, was that which stood behind the conquest of the land, and not the tribes of the north. Judah is not only significant in terms of the number of verses that it occupies, but also in terms of the actions attributed to it. The answer to the oracle in 1:1, asking who should first fight the Canaanites, is an unambiguous "Judah shall go up. I now deliver the land into their hands." The humiliation of Adonijah Bezek illustrates the total power of Judah, and the tradition that he was brought to Jerusalem, thus asserting Jerusalem is under Judean control, establishes Judean right over the later national capital. In our next session, we're going to read the balance of chapter 2 through the end of chapter 5. We'll read some short stories about Shamgar and Othniel. We'll read of Ehud's defeat of Elgon, the king of Moab. There's also poetry in the book of Judges. The story of Deborah in chapter 5 is poetry. We'll also revisit our friends from the book of Joshua and try to figure out how we are supposed to think about this relationship between the law of the land and why God's promise seems to have only partially been fulfilled. Although Joshua was intent upon emphasizing the limited nature of Israel's occupation of the land and connecting this up in some way with the limited nature of Israel's occupation of the law, the exact relationship between occupation of the land and of the law was never really explained in any explicit manner. That the book of Joshua's account for the progressive occupation of the land was at the same time a meditation upon Israel's continual attempts to occupy. The book of the law was a fundamental conclusion of the last chapter, but there is still a problem connected with this view. If Deuteronomic history was intent upon demonstrating how blessings flow from obedience and destruction from disobedience, it first had to explain how and why Israel did in fact receive the land at all, given their disobedience immediately following Sinai. Deuteronomy 9 and 10 dealt with this problem. Most of the book of Joshua examined the implications of these chapters from Deuteronomy. Israel would occupy the land although they had not merited it. But given the dying off of the first generation of Israelites outside the land, that is Moses' contemporaries, and given the wickedness of the nations and the promise that God made to the fathers, why was not the entire land given to Joshua's Israelites? For although the first generation of Israelites grossly sinned against God, and although each generation under the judges did likewise, there is no account of the Israelites under Joshua seriously betraying the covenant as a community. Apart from Israel's timidity in sending out spies to Jericho, we cannot find a more exemplary community than that depicted in Joshua. Although Joshua 23 acknowledged the fact, it never really explained why there had to be the peoples that are left among you. The book of Judges in its first chapters now turns to the problem of why Joshua was not able to drive out all the nations, and it will examine the implications of its answers in the subsequent history of Israel during the period of the Judges. I hope you can join us in our discussion Monday evening. If you need to, send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org to get the Zoom link. Have a good week.